Welcome to Jesus on Trial. Tonight we're here for a 2,000-year-old question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? But it's a question that we're going to address using the standards and procedures of our courts here in Western Australia. We are the People's Court of Western Australia here tonight. And the applicant tonight is City Bible Forum, our host. Representing the advocate is Mr. Ian Davidson. He is a barrister. He's a senior counsel and has been a barrister for 20 years. And he will be calling his witness, Professor Judge, who is a historian, who will be cross-examined on this question. The intervener is a new organisation, Australian Resurrection Skeptics, and they will be represented by Mr. Martin Hadley, who also will call an expert witness of his own, who will be examined after our intermission later in the evening. Now, his name is Professor Slezak. Tonight, we're wanting to think about this question with you as the jury. And so you're invited to hear the evidence presented this evening and then deliberate on the evidence that you hear. Overseeing our court is the Honourable Justice Kenneth Martin from the Supreme Court of Western Australia. And so in a moment he'll come in, but before that I get to fulfil a lifelong ambition and command you that there will be silence in court and all rise. Please be seated. In the People's Court of Western Australia, calling Civil Matter 1 of 2015, in the matter of an application for declaratory relief between City Bible Forum, applicant, and Australian Resurrection Skeptics intervener, court is in session.
Well, welcome to my court. I must say this is the biggest jury I've ever had to charge. Nevertheless, this promises to be a very interesting and stimulating event. I'd just like to say a few things about the nature of the process. We recognise, of course, that this is a highly sensitive and an area about which people have deep and profound beliefs and views. We certainly don't wish to offend or deprecate any of those beliefs. But tonight we're engaged in an intellectual process of applying the civil trial burden to the civil standard of evidence to this fascinating topic that has beguiled mankind for 2,000 years. We will proceed sensitively and respectfully on all sides. Can I explain the role of the jury in the process? The role of the jury is to listen carefully to the evidence and to render a true and fair verdict on the evidence. That is your role, and by your presence and participation, you've effectively committed to that process, for which I thank you. The mechanics of your deliberation in terms of considering the evidence at the close of the case will be explained to you by the organisers. Likewise, how you might render a vote and how at the end of the day that vote might be assessed and a verdict delivered. These are all mechanics that will be explained at the end. Thirdly, can I talk to you about evidence and the nature of evidence that you'll hear this evening? From watching television and the like, many of you will know that there's different varieties of evidence. There is direct evidence. So, for instance, when you were coming here tonight, if you witnessed an incident, a traffic accident or a crime or something of that kind, and you saw it, or you heard it, or you sensed it, these are matters about which you could get in the witness box and say, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, etc. That's one variety of evidence. Another variety of evidence is indirect evidence. And you probably have heard in the course of your day-to-day life the term hearsay. Hearsay evidence is evidence that's introduced for the purposes of proving the truth of a fact, but you didn't see it, you didn't hear it, you didn't sense it. Now, in the annals of history, perhaps the best example of somebody who was not convinced by hearsay evidence was Thomas the Apostle. And you remember perhaps the story that after he went to the rooms where the other apostles had been gathered and he was told that they'd seen the risen Jesus, that he said, well, I'm not going to believe that. I didn't see it, and until I see it, I'm not convinced. And then subsequently, you know from the Gospel of St. John that he did, according to his evidence, see, and at that point he believed. But the point I'm emphasising is that he did not accept hearsay evidence when others told him what they had seen. And the other point I want to add to that while we're talking about hearsay evidence is the hearsay evidence sometimes is very reliable, sometimes it isn't. Hearsay evidence might have a source. So, for instance, if Peter the Apostle tells Thomas, I've seen the risen Jesus, well, you know that the source is Peter. On the other hand, if it's Peter who tells Peter's brother, who tells Peter's mother, who tells Peter's uncle, who tells ultimately Thomas, that's about fourth or fifth hand hearsay. The reliability of hearsay evidence, once it becomes removed from a first-hand source, is increasingly less reliable. So that's another form of evidence. And in circumstances where we're considering events 2,000 years ago, it's unlikely that you're going to hear direct evidence tonight. There's another category of evidence that you are going to hear tonight, and that is opinion evidence. And the law, the civil law, accepts that there are people in certain disciplines who have expertise that qualifies them to express reliable opinions. And tonight, on either side of the argument, seeking declaratory relief, you're going to hear from the applicant, Professor Edwin Judge, whose expertise in the area of history and ancient history is not in question. There's no argument about his expertise as an expert. And then, after an intermission, the intervener is going to call their expert, another learned professor in the discipline of philosophy. This is Professor Peter Slezak. And both these respective experts in their fields are unquestioned in terms of their expertise. They will be questioned after they give their evidence in chief, their direct evidence, through the process of cross-examination, which in the civil law is a highly respected forensic process designed to probe and question and ultimately as a tool to unearth the truth. And then there will be closing arguments at the end of their evidence. So I ask you to distinguish two phases of this trial. Argument from counsel, which you'll hear at the start and at the end. You might be persuaded by argument, you might not. And then the respective professors will not be arguing, they will be giving opinion evidence, and that'll be the evidence for you to weigh up and assess. In terms of your decision, when you come to render a verdict in terms of yes or no as to whether you're satisfied that Jesus rose from the dead or not, this is a civil trial. It's not a criminal trial. You will know, I suspect, because you've probably watched too many television shows like me, that in crime there's a very venerated test for proof, and that is called proof beyond reasonable doubt. And that is in Western common law countries generally the standard at which we convict in a criminal case. This is not a criminal case. This is a civil case, and so the test to determine whether you're satisfied in terms of saying yes or no to the declaratory relief is not proof beyond reasonable doubt. It's proof on the balance of probabilities. Now, what does that phrase mean? Various people have attempted it. It sort of means more likely than not. But you might have a doubt, but if you can imagine the Roman goddess Justitia, which you will have seen represented in many television programs and the like. This is Justice blindfolded, but holding out the scales. And the scales tilt one way or the other, depending upon the grains on the scales and which way they find themselves balanced at the end of the process. So if you can think of yourself as gods or goddesses with the scales weighing the evidence that you're about to hear, and use that as the balance of probabilities when you come to render your verdict. Now, that's all I want to say by way of introduction to my jury. Thank you again for participating, and please pay attention to the arguments of counsel and the evidence that we're about to hear. And now for the applicant, I call on Senior Counsel, Mr. Davidson.
May it please the court. The applicant, City Bible Forum, seeks a declaration from this pleasingly large jury, the triers of fact, that Jesus rose from the dead. It is an extraordinary thing to claim that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. We all know that humans, after their death, do not reappear alive and in a body that is no longer subject to the inexorable process of decay and death. The apostles, frightened and confused after the crucifixion of Jesus, their apparently failed leader and teacher, also knew that with Jesus' shameful and humiliating death, all that they had hoped for from him to be Israel's Messiah was dead and buried with him. It was only from and after the third day that these early believers' whole world view changed so dramatically that they changed the world forever. Their dramatic change did not occur until after, first, the tomb where Jesus' dead body had been placed was seen by various women and by at least the apostles Peter and John to be mysteriously empty, until after, secondly and critically, the apostles, other followers, and even previous skeptics had experiences that they all attributed to their actually seeing and hearing Jesus alive again. Now, Christianity stands or falls on its claim that as a matter of actual history, at a specific time and place in history, Jesus of Nazareth experienced physical death, but was raised bodily on the third day after his death and with a transformed body, no longer subject to death. If that bodily resurrection of Jesus did not occur, Christianity fails. And as Pope Benedict XVI accurately said in the second part of his reflections on Jesus of Nazareth, the Christian faith stands or falls with the truth of the testimony that Christ is risen from the dead. Now, this dependence of the Christian faith on Jesus actually having been raised from the dead around AD 30 does not, of course, prove that this claim that he rose from the dead is true. So how does one investigate if that preposterous sounding claim is actually true or merely a misguided myth? Initially, a seeker of truth tries to assess the available evidence, and His Honour has drawn your attention to some of the types of available evidence. These proceedings provide a vehicle for you, the jury, to evaluate and study the evidence and decide what happened as a matter of history. Assessing what happened as a matter of history is an everyday occurrence in our courts, in both criminal or, as here, civil trials. Now, admittedly, hearings normally come on somewhat quicker than the almost 2,000 years here. I won't speculate if the delays in obtaining this hearing date were due to a deplorable lack of appropriate funding for our busy courts, or the delays of busy and/or dilatory counsel or expert witnesses in not providing their outlined submissions or reports sufficiently promptly, or to other factors. Our Professor Judge, our expert witness, is thoroughly familiar with both the writings of ancient mythology and of ancient history, and with the differences between myth, legends, propaganda, and real history. His expertise and experience in how to approach the study of history, commencing from before many of us were born, including but not limited to his preeminent expertise in the discipline known as ancient history and the Greco-Roman era when these relevant events occurred, should assist you in your onerous task of assessing the available evidence. The gospel or good news about Jesus, unlike many other belief systems, stands or falls on history. We anticipate that Professor Judge's evidence will persuade members of the jury willing to consider the actual evidence without dismissing it out of hand because of preconceived prejudice to the requisite civil standard that as a matter of history, Jesus rose from the dead. What you, as members of the jury, will do about that actual rising of Jesus from the dead is, of course, another challenging topic for all of us. However, the implications of what the actual rising of Jesus from the dead might require of you might well influence your preparedness or otherwise to accept the conclusions that we submit are compelled by the available evidence, namely that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, we all approach matters with pre-existing preconceptions. For committed believers, a preconception might be to say, well, the Bible says Jesus rose from the dead, therefore it must be true that the God of the Bible raised Jesus from the dead, whatever else history, science, and the application of common sense to the available evidence has to offer to challenge that pre-existing belief. For committed atheists, although Professor Judge may explain why the Romans viewed the early Christians as godless atheists with their irritating refusal to worship any of the Roman gods or the emperors, but committed atheists' preconceptions can include the use of slogans, we'd say like science trumps history, or because God doesn't exist, and because miracles that violate the established laws of nature are by definition impossible, it doesn't matter what the evidence shows. Jesus cannot have been raised from the dead by definition, and therefore any alternative explanation, no matter how implausible, should be adopted. In fact, we anticipate that Professor Judge may help explain why history actually produces science. So while we accept the onus of proof lies on us to establish that Jesus rose from the dead, don't forget to apply appropriate skepticism about what we submit may be fanciful alternatives against the bodily resurrection of Jesus, such as sometimes heard that Jesus just swooned and was revived by the cool tomb. Now, in these proceedings, your task will be, without fear or favour, affection or ill will, to do your best to assess the evidence about what actually occurred around AD 30 from the available evidence on its merits. Now, as the learned trial judge explained, the evidence will be submitted through the expert witnesses. Professor Judge will explain what historians can derive from dating the first references to the key Christian beliefs about the resurrection. And we say that the letter of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the verses 3 to 8, can be confidently dated as part of a letter written by Paul around AD 54 to 57, and that the visit of Paul to the Corinthian church that he refers to can be very reliably dated to about AD 50 to 51 because of other records showing that Gallio was the Roman proconsul in Corinth for that 12-month period, Rome apparently operating on the Australian tax year between 1 July and 30 June. However, the passage itself records what Paul must have received no later than within 3 years of his conversion, the Damascus Road experience, probably about AD 34, when he visited Jerusalem. And Paul records in his letter to the Galatians that he then stayed with the Apostle Peter for some 15 days and met Jesus' brother James. James is interesting as a person who appears although described as one of Jesus' brothers, never to have, or not to have accepted Jesus' divine calling until he saw Jesus raised from the dead. And decades later, the Jewish author Josephus, by then a friend of the Romans, records that James was stoned to death after Annas the Younger was installed as high priest. And this was a little after the death of the procurator Festus, who is referred in the Acts of the Apostle. And this was around AD 62. This passage, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, Paul records, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born." Professor Judge will explain how we anticipate how that written record of an already established oral tradition assists in showing, as do the reports in Acts, that the belief that Jesus was raised on the third day after he died and was buried was the central tenet of the early church from the earliest times following Jesus' crucifixion. Now, admittedly, Paul's evidence is hearsay. While evidentiary rules have exceptions, whereas here potential eyewitnesses are dead, Paul was not an eyewitness of the risen Jesus in those first few weeks after the resurrection. He received the testimony of at least Peter, who in one of his letters claimed to be an eyewitness, and presumably of James and others. Importantly, the persons to whom Christ appeared are identified by Paul in that passage. Not just Peter, with whom Paul spent the 15 days in Jerusalem, and then time in other locations, not just the 12 apostles, but 500, most of whom, unsurprisingly, were still living around AD 54 when that letter was written, although some had passed away, and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, while hearsay, the reference to James and Peter can be confidently assessed as first-hand hearsay in that they told Paul what they'd seen. While the more than 500 other witnesses were not identified, the assertion that most were alive in a letter written at that time would assist you to accept the likely veracity of what Paul wrote. Professor Judge will also comment on the gospel accounts and why discrepancies in the several versions from different sources should assist you in accepting their overall veracity on the critical issue for your decision. Professor Judge, being Professor Judge, may well deal with other aspects. So I'll very shortly conclude this opening to leave time for his evidence and its testing by my learned friend, Mr. Hadley. The beloved disciple in John's Gospel asserts that he was an eyewitness to relevant events, particularly seeing the empty tomb and seeing the risen Christ on several occasions, including along with the remaining disciples, except for doubting Thomas, who the trial judge has already highlighted was a man who rejected hearsay evidence. But then the following week, Jesus appeared. John records that he was there when Jesus appeared with all of the disciples, with particular reference to Thomas, who on seeing and probably touching the risen Jesus, from then on ceased to doubt. You may not be aware that Doubting Thomas is the new patron saint of the Australian Skeptics, Inc. Now, that is not an organisation, that is not today's intervener, the Australian Resurrection Skeptics, but my learned friend has association with both organisations, and Mr. Hadley will now open for the defence.
Yes, your opening statement, Mr. Hadley.
Thank you, Your Honour. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight because of my involvement with a well-established organisation, the Australian Skeptics. The word atheist does not appear in our name or in our rules. Believers can be members, and as far as we know, some are. We, in the Australian Skeptics, urge people to be curious. We urge people to investigate what they are curious about. When they investigate something, we urge people not to rely on anecdotes or dogma. We urge them to investigate using sound techniques. we urge them to be honest in considering the results and to accept the consequences of their investigations in a positive spirit and with good grace. Now, members of the jury, you can combine and use those techniques and apply them to the investigation of the claims that will be made by my learned friend and his witness tonight. He should not appeal to your faith, if you have faith. He should not appeal to any mystical experience that you may have had in your life. Mr. Davidson asserts that something happened as a matter of historical reality, something that he says never happened before nor since. He says that events happened which involved well-established laws of nature being turned off. The idea is that a dead human came back to life, not as some sort of a ghost, but in material form. And the story is that this resurrected body did various things that were conventional for humans, such as eating. And he also did things, or he's alleged to have done things, that are described as miraculous, such as helping fishermen to catch 153 fish, such as unlocking doors or somehow getting through doors. And after a few weeks of doing things like that, he was taken up to heaven. From then, his return was imminently expected. And after tonight, I urge you to go and have a close look at Acts. You'll see from the book of Acts the strange things that believers did in the expectation of an imminent return of this person who had resurrected and supposedly gone up to heaven. Things like selling assets and pooling their assets and acting as if who needed to hold assets since Jesus was coming back any moment now. They were eagerly awaiting his return. It has been eagerly awaited ever since. Returning to the resurrection, ladies and gentlemen, no one claims to have seen the dead body actually come back to life and start to do the things attributed to it. That's an important point. You are asked tonight to infer that resurrection from other circumstances. Circumstances such as a body that disappeared. Secondly, appearances of a person who was initially not recognised as Jesus. Initially not recognised on a number of occasions, but was eventually taken to be Jesus by these followers. You will hear, ladies and gentlemen, that there are problems with the evidentiary status of these stories. And in legal terms, as my friend has conceded, there is a hearsay problem, but I say it's a major hearsay problem with almost all of the pro-resurrection evidence that will be referred to tonight. An important part of our case, ladies and gentlemen, is that assuming the events actually happened, assuming that the texts, the ancient texts that my friend will refer to, assuming that what they say did happen, so putting aside authenticity problems and veracity problems, on the assumption that they did happen, the resurrection is not the only explanation for what we read there. We, ladies and gentlemen, have alternative explanations to offer you. Our alternatives do not require the laws of nature to be turned off temporarily. My learned friend will ask you to reject all of our natural alternatives in favour of his supernatural conclusion. You may think that the alternatives we refer to are strange and unlikely, and I'm inclined to agree. However, none of them are as unlikely as the idea that my learned friend will ask you to accept. Tonight you'll be asked to consider a number of things. You will need to consider a number of things to reach your decision. Primarily, the quality of the evidence. Secondly, the nature of the assertions that are being made in that evidence. And thirdly, whether those assertions are compelling, whether they are compelling compared to the alternatives. Now, the evidence relied on by the pro-resurrection case is not first rate. Almost all of it is hearsay. In other words, the writer is repeating what some other person has told them. A further problem is that the writer is repeating something that he heard from somebody else a long time after the event that is referred to. So we've got two problems. We've got a directness problem and we've got a delay problem. And in modern courts, these things both detract very much from the reliability of the evidence. And don't forget that reliability is a different concept from honesty. You can have honest witnesses who have done their best, but they are not reliable for various other reasons. And delay and getting something second-hand or even third or fourth-hand, these matters detract from the reliability of evidence. The tiny amount of eyewitness evidence that you can find in my friend's evidence, such as a little snippet in John where he says, I saw this myself. The tiny amount of eyewitness evidence was written from memory decades after the events. That's another problem even for the direct evidence. In a criminal trial, ladies and gentlemen, a jury is asked to accept what the prosecution says and convict a person. And I mention criminal trials because mostly juries are in criminal trials. If you find yourself serving on a jury in this state, outside a hypothetical performance like this, you will probably be deciding allegations by a prosecution case against a person, and the prosecution will be asking you to convict that person. That is a very serious matter. Tonight, your task is also serious. You are asked to say yes to the pro-resurrection case. It is not enough for you to accept that the pro-resurrection case could be possible. It must be compelling to you. You must put aside your preconceptions, if you have any, including the idea that the resurrection is an uplifting and comforting story that could bring joy to mankind if mankind believed it. In a real jury trial, people should not be convicted if the allegations against them are too hard to believe or when there is a viable alternative explanation. And that's what's behind this phrase you've probably heard about, a reasonable doubt. A person should not be convicted by a jury if the allegations against that person are too hard to believe or when there is a viable alternative explanation. And you'll hear tonight that in relation to the pro-resurrection case, both of those characteristics are present. We have allegations that can only be described as incredible and supernatural. And secondly, you'll have from us alternative explanations which are entirely natural. I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Your Honour.
Now proceed to the evidence. Mr. Davidson, do you call your first witness?
Call Professor Judge.
Yes. Professor Judge, if you could approach the witness box, please. Yes, thank you, Professor Judge. I'll ask Mr. Davidson to lead your evidence.
Thank you, Your Honour. Professor, is it your serious contention that it is historically warranted to believe that Jesus really left his tomb bodily raised?
Yes, there are arguably historical warranting that makes that to a reasonable degree likely.
And what do you say those historical warrants are?
The extraordinarily unusual character of the witnesses, the fact that we have several much considered and discussed and researched versions of what happened in the 4 different Gospels, clearly based not upon immediate response, but upon critical discussion, disagreement, and so on, across at least a generation, a very significant lapse of time in terms of reaching a full and tested judgment on matters of what happened. And yet the actual details that the individual Gospels record are extraordinarily slight. The only things that happen to be focused on in each of the 4 Gospels are that the stone was removed from the tomb. That's one. That the people who verified this or reported it in each case are women, and that at some point, in various ways, people suddenly realized that they were encountering Jesus again in what appears to be a bodily form, or they sensed as that.
What is the relevance when you said that people who verified were women? What relevance does that have?
Most critics of these matters, and I think, believe that it was all triggered off by the conviction that Jesus was alive again. That is, it was not the discovery of the stone rolled away which set in motion an interpretative sequence of events. It was that the mysterious encounters raised the question, well, what about the body? And then questions must have flashed around, well, didn't anyone check it, and where is the body? Now, if you were in that position, trying to rustle up the evidence in a short retrospect and seeking incontrovertible evidence, they tell me that in Jewish practice, the evidence of women would be technically invalid anyway. If that's correct, as I'll leave it is, it is a fascinating testimony to the intention of the gospel writers only to bring forward things that were specifically verified even after the event, after much discussion and doubt, by the only people who could say it. There is a gross lack of any interpretative or imaginary filling out of the picture in the gospel accounts. They do not tell us the things that cry out to the imagination. They do not tell us, for example, what Jesus looked like when he came out. They didn't know. No one saw it. The fact that there are diverse versions is a source of historical strength, in my view. Whenever something important with great consequences is claimed to have happened, witnessed directly by various people in one part or another of it, one invariably gets very diverse, detailed information. Some saw one thing, some saw another, sometimes one person saw it, sometimes 2. The fact that all these nominal discrepancies are there in the accounts is a mark of the veracity of the accounts. and their determination only to say what they could vouch for. A modern historian knows how to work with that kind of evidence. It is trustworthy. All the things that are remembered are true for somebody.
Now, Mr. Hadley commented, and correctly, in his opening that there's no actual description of the resurrection itself. And what does that lack of description of the resurrection itself suggest to you in terms of the veracity of these reports?
I'm suddenly disconcerted by loss of my papers. And so could kindly...
Yes. Should I repeat the question?
Yes.
Mr. Hadley commented on the fact that the gospel accounts do not actually record anyone as seeing Jesus actually being raised from the dead. And I wanted to ask you, what does that omission suggest to you in terms of the veracity of the gospel reports?
Well, it seems to me, obviously, that that's what people would like to have known. And at later stages, in the 2nd century AD, people provided vivid descriptions of what it looked like, and even more remarkably, of what Jesus had been doing in hell since his crucifixion. It is natural that curiosity should want these things, but that kind of curiosity has not been met in the carefully sifted accounts we have, because nobody had seen it.
And you said those vivid descriptions were in the 2nd century. Dealing first with the 4 gospel records, what approximate dates were they, to your understanding, written?
The 3rd gospel, nominally called Luke, describes in its opening 4 verses a quite elaborate and very self-conscious stock-taking of various sources of information. In other words, it was written a good generation at least, or more in some people's view. Some people have even argued it's a 2nd century document. I don't think that. But certainly before or after perhaps the year AD 70, the Great Revolt. And the 4th gospel, similarly, at the end of it, refers to the extensive amount of material that was available. So we know that a huge attention developed rapidly in the wake of the great apostolic preaching which developed. It was challenged, of course, at every point, as the book of Acts makes clear, and so there would have been a very vigorous searching and cross-questioning and refuting going on, and all 4 gospels are presumably the end product of that process. And one must ask, therefore, what is the authoritative content of it? And the usual way of understanding that, which I think is right, is that Matthew was himself one of the 12. He was the tax gatherer. But he speaks to the domestic Jewish tradition, and it's suggested, echoes the kind of picture of Jesus that would have been cultivated in Jewish circles around James, the Apostle James, and subsequently James, the brother of Jesus himself. So it has that kind of authority. Mark is thought to be, we know from other New Testament evidence, the companion of Peter and at some stage in Rome. So it represents the tradition that it came through in Peter's circle. Luke, we know from the Acts, was a traveling companion of Paul, and therefore we have the tradition that was available in his circles, and that is very important because one of the striking features of the Gospels is that they bear no imprint at all of Pauline theology.
Now, can you just clarify that Paul's letters were written before the Gospels?
That's right.
Is that correct?
Paul's letters are our primary source, including his statement, which you've already read out, about the essence of the Gospel. And we know he had a huge interpretative drive. He had to explain, he'd after all been the champion against the gospel preaching. So he knew what was wrong with it from a Jewish point of view in every respect, and he could refute it. After his dramatic conversion, he had to answer his own case. And in his letters, you can see him hammering out the doctrine of atonement, for example, develops as part, I conjecture, it's not just me, but Leon Morris taught me this, developed probably out of his need to answer the claim he would have developed that it's impossible for the Messiah to be humiliated and disgraced as Jesus was, and so on.
Yes, and yet the doctrine of atonement, you say, is not explained or developed in the gospel accounts of the resurrection.
I'm not saying that, no. Paul himself is writing as an argumentative theologian, he was of course familiar. He would have checked with Peter and James and John on his visits, which are described. So that he was, of course, au fait with the material about Jesus. The interesting thing is he doesn't constantly cite Jesus.
Yes.
But biblical theologians can easily relate his conscious intellectual interpretation of the meaning of the death of Jesus with the hints and comments that Jesus himself made, as the Gospels make clear about what his fate was to be.
Yes, and just wrapping it up so you can be exposed to cross-examination, you say that the Gospel writers set out the limited evidence that they set out, and they don't deal with Paul's argumentative or detailed approach. Is that correct?
Yes, you see, the Gospel writers are not compiling theological treatises. They are, however, conceived and developed under the power of an overarching and powerful idea, namely the significance of the resurrection.
All right.
And thus, the selection of the material in the Gospels is made for a strong, dominating purpose. And yet the actual texts, the texts of the things Jesus is supposed to have said in various episodes, are not themselves, as it were, continually, in a systematic theological way, coordinated into part of a theological argument. They are presented as reporters present them, the things he actually did, the things he actually said, and so on. But the overarching idea is clear. That's what the Gospel is about.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Hadley will ask you some questions.
Professor, thank you, Your Honour. Professor, you have expressed the opinion that each Gospel writer came to what you called a, quote, full and tested judgment. Do you remember saying that?
Say it again, please.
You said that in your opinion, each Gospel writer came to, quote, a full and tested judgment of the material they wrote. Now, taking Luke, for example, he did not witness any of the things he wrote about personally, did he?
No.
He introduces his gospel in the manner of a would-be historian and effectively claims to have done the best he could do to put down what the stories are.
Yes.
Yes?
It is more subtle than that.
So how are we able to see how Luke tested the material he had and came to what you call a full and tested judgment?
An important thesis was written in Britain, and you'll think me immodest, but it was said in reaction to a lecture I gave once in Oxford. And the author of this thesis concentrated it on the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel and gave an elaborate answer to your question, which is published.
So you're satisfied by Luke's claim of his own achievement, in effect?
Well, he sets out very carefully, with respect, sir, if you look carefully at the sentences in the first 4 verses, they are extraordinarily skillfully conducted. It's not just a general statement, the wording, the technical terms, and so on. And the result of the thesis that was written on that is to demonstrate philologically that the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel are done in the professional manner of technical literature of the time, not in the traditional manner of a classical history. A classical history in the Greco-Roman culture was not concerned with ultimate validation of anything. What it was concerned with was to, of course, to use testimony. That was essential. But to use it in a constructive way to achieve an ethical purpose. And there were established rhetorical styles in which what we would call historical information should be presented to be persuasive. When people nowadays, for example, ask us, which professional historians hate, by the public to tell us the lessons of history, are we falling like the Roman Empire fell, for example? No historian will answer that kind of question because it arises from a false view of the course of history, namely...
Well, Professor, whatever label you give to Luke or what he was trying to achieve, whether it was as an historian or something else, it's true, isn't it, that he hasn't given us any specific information about his sources, his direct sources or his hearsay sources?
The technical terms he uses clearly pinpoint that he is writing a technical introduction.
He doesn't give us names, though, does he, Professor?
Scientific study.
He doesn't give us names of anyone, though, does he, Professor?
No, it's the terminology.
We're invited to trust him, in effect.
No, you're invited to trust the philological analysis that has been done on that and which is internationally accepted.
Turning to the subject of the empty tomb, each gospel writer refers to the tomb being found empty, don't they?
The only detail that is, I think, common to them all is that the stone was rolled away.
Matthew's account is somewhat different from the others, isn't it?
Yes, the accounts differ in interesting ways.
He describes an earthquake, thunder, and the stone rolling open.
Yes.
Although he certainly didn't see that himself, did he?
No.
Does it bother you that Matthew is the only one to report this Donner and Blitzen phenomenon?
Not in the slightest, no.
Even though you said that there was no filling out by any of these gospel writers, doesn't that sound like filling out to you?
It's the detail, the colourful language and that kind of thing will be something that has come down to him in the discussion and debate as the witness of the women was assessed.
When you say discussion and debate, aren't we back to the same problem as with Luke, that what he has done is to assess competing anecdotes, or some competing, some consistent, but you've said that he's weighed things up. But they're all anecdotes that he's looking at. Isn't that a problem?
No. There are specific testimonies going back to individuals who were identified, who claimed they had seen these things. It is a basic appeal to the sense, to sense data. They have seen with their eyes what they report and no more. They may report it in picturesque language.
Well, Matthew says, tomb closed, thunder, lightning, door rolls open. The others say that the tomb was found with the door open and the body gone. That's true, isn't it?
Yes,
that's a fair summary. Yeah. Now, dealing with the other three, apart from Matthew, what they describe, tomb found, door open, body gone, that's just as if some people had opened the tomb and taken the body, isn't it?
Oh, there are half a dozen explanations which one can use as to what might have happened. It might never have been put there in the first place. All sorts of suggestions have been made.
Do you agree with my specific suggestion that it would look just as it would look like if the tomb had been opened by people in a very worldly manner, very natural manner?
There are all sorts of apparently plausible explanations, but these explanations have been around for 2,000 years. They have been debated, criticised, and not one of them has ever found strong support in a widespread way as an obvious explanation of what happened.
So is that you agreeing with my proposition that the tomb looks the way it would have looked if it had been opened by people?
Oh, I'm not objecting to that, but I am saying that I'm losing my point a bit, but ask me another question.
All right. So, back.
Yes.
You accept or reject the hypothesis of grave robbing or something of
Oh,
that
no,
kind?
I don't accept that.
I didn't put it that way, with respect, Your Honour.
Perhaps
what
you'd
I
like
s-
to put it, Mr. Hadley.
I'll summarise it. The ladies found the tomb with the door open and the body gone, and I'm saying that's just the way it would have looked if people had opened it, as opposed to supernatural forces.
This is one of half a dozen and more such explanations which can be offered. My point really is that the intense debate since antiquity, these things aren't new debates. They've been going on for 2,000 years. And when, on purely historiographical grounds, the quality, that is modern historiographical grounds. There's a great work on this being published in the year 2010.
That's a very long answer to a specific question, with respect, Professor.
Yes.
Don't you agree with what I'm saying? It looks the way it would have looked if people had opened the door and taken the body out.
Yes, but there are half a dozen other things that you can say about it, other possible ways. But that doesn't get you anywhere, because you don't get any accumulated historiographical judgment in all the debates that have gone on, other than that it's congruent with the appearance of Jesus still alive.
Two obvious possibilities to a well-balanced observer of the situation that the ladies found are these, I suggest. Firstly, it's possible that Joseph, as the owner of the tomb, had legally opened it and moved the body. You'd agree that's one possibility?
Oh yes, I'm willing to agree with lots of possibilities, but they're only
I'd
possibilities.
like you to do so briefly if you can. So yes will be sufficient. And the second possibility is that others have illegally opened that tomb and robbed it, which would have been a very serious offence. I think it was a capital offence, wasn't it?
Yes.
Now, don't you agree that there is no historical indication of any inquiry into that significant problem?
Well, yes, but I'm not surprised that there's been no indication.
See, Joseph is only mentioned in the Bible, correct me if I'm wrong, when he takes the body from Pilate and puts it in Joseph's tomb.
Yes.
He's not mentioned before or since that incident, is he?
I understand now.
Not in the Bible or in any secular source either, is he mentioned?
Not that I know of, no.
Matthew mentions a rumour, doesn't he, started by the Jews that some disciples took the body. You remember that?
Yes.
If so, those disciples could have been prosecuted with a serious offence.
Yes.
And in Acts, it mentions the disciples being charged with various other offences, doesn't it?
Yes.
But there is no mention anywhere of anyone being charged with robbing that tomb,
Yes.
or of anybody even inquiring of Joseph whether he might have been the one who opened it up.
Yes.
So, if the tomb had been found empty in the way described by the ladies, how do you explain the lack of interest by people who should have been very interested in that strange situation? It was either a serious civil crime, or Joseph had taken it for some reason, in which case Jesus' followers would love to know where the body was, or some other possibility. Why is there no indication of, as a matter of history, of any investigation?
Well, that itself shows that either nobody thought it was of any consequence, or if they did, they hadn't any explanation to offer. Now, we know that the Jerusalem authorities, according to the book of Acts, took strenuous efforts to stop the preaching of the gospel, which would, of course, have centred on the claim that the tomb was empty. Yet there's no suggestion there, admittedly in a Christian source, but there's no suggestion there that the matter was being argued as to whether it was empty. So I just assume, and frankly I think that in the technical literature that's what everybody assumes, that there was no convincing explanation or way of finding out what, if anything else, was relevant. And the general conclusion historiographically is that the most plausible explanation is the one we've got.
So you assume that Joseph was, for example, questioned, but nobody has recorded that fact. Is that what you assume?
I don't necessarily assume that, no.
I think I've only got 5 minutes left, which is perhaps enough time to ask you some questions about Paul and his reference to the 500, which my learned friend referred to in his opening address. So Paul refers to Jesus appearing to 500 people, but Paul was certainly not there at the time.
Yeah.
This is another event, isn't it, Professor, that Paul passes on as something he received?
That's right.
Right. Paul does not say who told him, does he?
No,
He doesn't name any of the 500 people.
no.
He does claim that most of them are still alive. And you'd agree, wouldn't you, that commentators have taken that reference as an invitation for readers to check the veracity of what Paul is saying?
Yes, well, Paul himself considers it a weighty point. That's why he says it.
But he's writing to believers in Corinth, isn't he? Wouldn't you say, Professor, that he would expect these believers to take his word for it, for starters? But if they don't, Professor, is he saying, well, you can travel down from Corinth to wherever this happened, which he doesn't state? Is that how we are supposed to read it? Well, isn't that the case? He's saying, in effect, if you want to check this, you can come from Corinth down here and start to try and find these 500 people. I'm not telling you who they are, and I'm not telling you where it happened.
No, I presume he knows it second hand, obviously, that that's the case, that there was this mass appearance and that a large number of people claim to have seen it and that some of them are still alive and presumably there would have been an intensely argumentative.
But isn't the invitation somewhat idle, as if these people will seriously travel all that way when he's given them next to no information? It's a rhetorical device, isn't it?
No, he's trying to give an accumulated, staged verification of something which culminates in his own experience, because he himself puts himself in that sequence using the same verb, which you can translate in different ways, but was manifested or seen, if you like, ophthe, for those who know Greek. He himself is the last in the series. Now, you may know what happened to him.
No, but we're talking about the 500.
Yes.
He doesn't give the reader any guidance as to who they are,
No.
but he gives us implied invitation that they can come down and start investigating. Meanwhile, there's no indication, is there, that any of those 500 people wrote anything about that incident to anybody else, is
It
there?
would be assumed that the numerous previous studies and sources of information referred to in the third gospel and at the end of the fourth would include some of those people. That would be what I would assume.
I suggest to you that this hearsay account from Paul is the only reference in the Bible to the appearance to 500 people.
Yes.
And if that had happened, it would surely have come to the attention of at least the Jewish authorities, if not the Roman authorities, an appearance to 500 people in one instance. Don't you agree?
Yes.
You would respect...
Sorry, I think Professor wants to amplify his answer.
Sorry, you said yes, and then...
I'm
You
sorry.
would
I'm
Did you
sorry.
want to add something?
Yes, I'd like to just say that I'm not quite sure where the question is leading, but what it leads me to think is that it all arises because plainly the Jewish authorities were not themselves dealing with where the body is. I mean, the matter could have been settled if a body could have been produced or if a watertight account of where it had gone could be given. Apparently that was not possible.
Well, my proposition to you was that an appearance to 500 people of a risen Jesus would have come to the attention of the Jewish authorities, but there's no indication of any reports or investigations about that, is there?
No, nor would really expect that. The sources which we have are all Christian, as you say.
Well, I suggest that if it had come to the attention of the Romans that a person they had crucified was walking the earth, that would have warranted a mention somewhere, and it would be referred to somewhere.
No,
There'd be a report to Tiberius, surely.
No, not at all. That's not how the Roman government worked.
There's no indication of any such report,
No,
though, is
a
there?
Roman governor had no obligation whatsoever to follow up things like that. No problem.
There's no indication of even any internal investigation. I've almost finished.
No, of course not. I mean, a Roman governor was completely sovereign in such matters.
In Acts, there is a reference to how many disciples there were at a time slightly after this alleged event, isn't there? I think the number is 150, or is it
I've forgotten the number.
120, something like that. 100 and something, do you recall that?
No, I've forgotten the number.
I suggest that if Jesus had appeared to 500 people, if later on there were only 150 disciples, then it seems that at least 350 of the 500 were not convinced on that occasion.
No, I wouldn't conclude that.
Either that, I suggest, or figure of 500 looks like a large exaggeration on Paul's part.
It's a general figure, yes.
A general figure.
I didn't say exaggeration.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. My time is
Yes.
up, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr. Hadley. Any re-examination, Mr. Davidson?
Just checking the time. Very short, given the time, Your Honour. Just those two possibilities that were suggested to you about the empty tomb. First, that Joseph of Arimathea took and moved the body, and the body was buried. That was the evening before the Sabbath.
I gather so, yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, you gathered so. And for a Jewish person to do something during the Sabbath, in terms of removing bodies, can you shed any light on that?
No, I'm not into Judaica, but I've always assumed that it was not something that should happen on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do any work.
And having asked Pilate to have possession of the body, on this scenario, Pilate there would have had to be a moving of the body before the early morning of the after the Sabbath.
You mean if robbers had taken it or something?
Right. The next theory was that perhaps the disciples might have taken the body, and that I think a suggestion was put they might have been concerned to reveal that because it was something that could be prosecuted. What light can you shed on the fact that the disciples, very shortly after the alleged resurrection, didn't seem to be worried about the risks to their personal safety from preaching the resurrection, in terms of the theory that they would have hidden their taking the body because of their concern about being prosecuted?
You're asking me what conclusion
Yes.
I draw from that?
Yes.
I consider that it shows that the issue didn't exist, that they were not in danger of being prosecuted for tomb robbery. There was a law. There is, in fact, from Palestine itself, a Roman decree extant threatening people for disturbing tombs. But this is part of the general currency of life. Tombs are sacrosanct, and people, for various reasons, want to raid tombs. But the fact that this law isn't part of the scene, I mean, it would have been easy, presumably, to proceed against the disciples for having robbed if this was seriously thought. And the disciples, for their part, obviously are not nervous of being charged with any such thing, presumably because there was a conundrum. The body wasn't there and no one knew where it was.
Thank you, Professor. See the time, Your Honour.
Yes. All right, that's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Professor, Judge, thank you for assisting the court and the jury with your evidence. Your evidence is complete. You may now leave the witness box and you're excused.
Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we'll just take a half an hour break and then we'll resume with the defendant's expert. So court will now adjourn.
Well, welcome back from our intermission. Juries aren't normally allowed to discuss the case while it's still in process, so I trust that you found other things to talk about while you're out there. But we're about to get underway again with the cross-examination or the examination of our second expert witness, Professor Slezak. So if you would all rise, please. Please be seated.
Yes, now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for paying attention during the first phase of the case. We're now moving into the phase of the intervener's evidence. So I'll ask Mr. Hadley if he'd call his witness.
I call Professor Slezak.
Yes, Professor. Mr. Hadley.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, Professor, I appreciate that you could give us a great deal about each question I'm going to ask you, but I'm going to ask you to keep your answers quite brief because you've only got 10 minutes to give your evidence. Do you understand that?
Yes, thank you.
What do you say, Professor, about the quality of the historical evidence of the resurrection?
Look, what I want to say about the quality of the historical evidence is that although our testimony so far has been reliant on that, it's the weakest form of evidence that's conceivable if we're asking the question whether Jesus rose from the dead. This is not a historical question. The question is fundamentally to do with kind of evidence that I will talk about if I have the chance, which is to do with what's plausible and what's possible given what we know about science. So really, it falls into the realm of the philosophy of science, which is my area of expertise, not history.
Professor Judge referred to the differences in the gospel accounts, and he has said that to him the differences are reassuring. What do you say in response to that?
It must be the only case where conflicting and contradictory evidence is reassuring. Normally, this means that, especially when they're contradictory, they can't both be right. And so the attempt to find some reconciliation is really cheating, because it means that the evidence is not available to tell you what is true, and the conflicting evidence may all be false. So the idea that this helps evidence is really not the way in which we assess conflicting evidence. It's dependent on the fact that we have a prior conviction, or Christians have a prior belief about what the truth must be, and so they pretend that the conflicting evidence somehow helps their case, but it's quite the contrary.
Would you tell us what happened to the Gnostic Gospels? Tell us what they were and what happened to them.
Well, look, there's an interesting story. Apart from, as many people may know, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945, but around the same time in Egypt, in a place called Nag Hammadi, they discovered an extraordinary a treasure trove of Gospels that there was, I think, 52 or more books that were contemporary. They were early Christianity books, and they told a very different story. And the most important fact, briefly, is that the Gnostic Gospels were a conflicting version of Christianity, early Christianity, which happened not to make it into what's called the canon. And the reason for that is that it's a political conflict between the Christians that saw Jesus as the Saviour and as having been resurrected. The Gnostics didn't believe Jesus was resurrected, and they didn't believe in him as divine. They thought of him just as an inspiring leader. So the interesting point about that is that modern Christianity, in a sense, as one of the scholars, Elaine Pagels, points out, is like all history, is written by the victors. And in this case, the winners happen not to be those that believed something quite different. So modern Christianity isn't the only version of what historical evidence shows.
Tonight we've been talking about miracles and history. What do you say is the relationship between miracles and history?
Well, as I started saying, it's a very important, it's a central question here. His Honour pointed out that in a case like this, we're talking about the balance of probabilities, and he mentioned the scale. Well, that's exactly the right point here. Miracles are not a question of history. The historical evidence suggests all sorts of things that might or might not have happened. The evidence is actually very poor. But what's relevant to this is that the miracles, as I'll get to perhaps a bit later on, are defined by the famous philosopher David Hume as something which is a violation of the laws of nature. This is not a question of history. It doesn't matter what history tells you. If the claim is that something was a miracle, it means that it can't happen, according to our best understanding of science. So you can think of anything that is contrary to the laws of nature. You simply discount what history tells you if the claim is miraculous or paranormal. And so in this case, although the Christians rely, as we've seen, entirely, in fact, as the counsel opposing said, Christianity depends on the veracity of the history. It's got the weakest possible case when it's depending on a miracle that can't possibly have happened according to our best science.
Now, you've considered the arguments of William Lane Craig about the relationship between miracles and history, I think.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, briefly, Craig is one of the most important philosophers who understands science, and he understands history, and he's an apologist for Christianity, but he's also a very competent philosopher. And when he talks about the miracle of the resurrection, in his arguments for resurrection, he says quite bluntly and frankly at the very beginning, it depends first on a belief in God. Now, that's telling you that there's a prior conviction about what must have happened and how to explain it. And the question is the explanation. So, briefly, without going into it here, there are several classical arguments for the existence of God. I think they're all bad. I mean, you know, I'm an atheist and I believe in science, and we can't go through them, the cosmological first cause argument and various others. They're all open to serious dispute, and the fact is that the resurrection itself, in the view of one of the leading scholars, depends on a prior belief in God. And the reason is simple. The reason is that you assume that God is omnipotent, and therefore he can create miracles. And therefore, you point to certain things in history which you say, well, of course, God could have done anything because he's omnipotent, therefore he made this particular Christian miracle. But that doesn't follow from the belief in God. Even if all the arguments work and God exists, let's say for the sake of argument I concede that, that doesn't prove Christianity. It could prove anybody's religion. God could have done the miracles for the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl, who also came back. So it doesn't help.
Are you saying, Professor, that if a person did not believe in God and they read the resurrection story, that will not cause them to believe in God?
It can't possibly. Firstly, the history is very doubtful. I mean, I haven't got time to go into all of the ways in which scholars like Ehrman and various others and Bultmann a while back showed, and I've got wonderful quotes here, there's nothing in the history that is credible because of the tenuous nature of the evidence. None of it is written by eyewitnesses. They were written decades later. The only fragments we've got are a couple of fragments that are, the kind of real evidence. So, again, without being able to go into it, I mean, for example, the other thing that's relevant is the contemporary Greek and Latin scholars didn't mention anything about Jesus at all. So, the history just on its own leaves open serious doubt. Even the existence of Jesus can be questioned as a historical fact. Now, even if you concede all of that, one of the things I want to say is that I'm actually happy to concede all the history for the sake of this question. The question of whether Jesus was resurrected and rose from the dead as a miracle, because it doesn't depend on the history, I'm happy to say, for the sake of argument, let's say it happened exactly assuming there were no contradictions in the scriptures. Assume it happened exactly the way, I don't know, Mel Gibson said in his movie. Let's say we had a video of the whole thing. That tells you that you have certain observations, the empty tomb. You've got all of the stories that are reported. None of that establishes that there was a miracle. It tells you that, as was admitted by counsel and by the other witness, there's all sorts of stories. Now, what's interesting about that is they were very dismissive of all the other stories, as though they were fanciful was the word that the professor used. Fanciful by what standard? I mean, more fanciful than a miracle? That's just being rude to all sorts of plausible theories, which one, as he rightly conceded, people have, the grave was robbed, that they put him in the wrong tomb, they went to the wrong tomb, that's why it was empty. I mean, there's a whole lot of stories you can tell. Any story you can make up about what happened based on the evidence has got to be more plausible than the resurrection, because the resurrection's impossible. So it doesn't matter what story you can cook up.
I think we have 2 or 3 more minutes, is that right? I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, Mr. Slezak, and one could be answered at great length, but I'm going to ask you to do your best to keep it brief. Does David Hume say that miracles are impossible, or is his message more subtle, or what does he say?
No, it's a bit more subtle. David Hume is a very famous philosopher from the 18th century, and I quote him and rely on him, so I'll do it without reading out large quotes from him. But he actually gives exactly the metaphor that his honour used. He said that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and the scales is what I always do in class, exactly the way his honour did. And his point is that he's got a phrase where he says something to the effect that there could not be more evidence against a miracle than the fact that all of our science says it's impossible. Nothing could be stronger as evidence against it, because we only have, on the one hand, testimony. It's not that miracles are impossible, but in the case of the biblical miracles, he's explicit about the resurrection and the biblical miracles, we've got very dubious testimony, and he puts it very precisely. You have to decide which is the bigger miracle, that Jesus rose from the dead, or that one of these other stories might be the case, that people lied or they were deluded. Which is the biggest miracle? Well, you go for the least miracle, and all the other stories are more plausible, basically.
You heard me refer to atheism in my opening address. What do you say about atheism?
Well, look, it's a very important distinction. It was mentioned that the skeptics are officially not atheists, but I am, and there's a reason for that. Again, it's to do with this balance. Let me say very quickly why it's rationally preferred and rationally required, in a way, to be an atheist, not an agnostic. It's the scale. You're only an agnostic when, about some questions, I'm an agnostic about lots of questions where it's not settled, and the evidence is equivocal. When
Do you
it's
mean
even,
the
so
scales?
you deal with the scales.
Do you mean the scales that His Honour referred to, or is it
Sorry?
something different? Do you mean the scales of justice
Yeah,
that His Honour
well, not
referred
of justice, of evidence. I'm talking about evidence.
Evidence, yeah.
So when there's lots of questions, I don't know whether string theory is true or something, all sorts of things you can think of, where you sit on the fence. You sit on the fence where you don't know where the evidence lies, where the weight of evidence lies. In the case of the miracle of a resurrection or the existence of God, the evidence is so weak that all of the evidence is on the other side, and especially the resurrection miracle, as I'm saying. And so David Hume's point is the one that I think is right. You don't have to be an atheist in relation to God's existence, because all of our science tells us that it's not possible and the arguments are all bad. So that's why it's relevant to be an atheist. And you don't have a prior reason, like Craig does and others do, to accept miraculous stories because you don't think there's a God anyway.
So in terms of where the scales end up for you...
Sorry, I'm turning off my timer.
This is my last question. In terms of the scales of atheism, agnosticism, where does it end up for you?
Well, in terms of God, there's just no reason to believe in a God. All the arguments, as I say, are really bad, and if we went through them all, I'd show you, as I do with my classes in the whole semester, why none of the classic arguments are good enough rational grounds to believe in God. And as far as the miracles go, then you've got no other prior reason to believe that any of the historical stories lead you to such an impossible account, when you've got all sorts of much more plausible ways of explaining the evidence, which is not necessarily itself questioned.
Thank you, Professor. Now my learned friend will ask you some questions.
Professor, is this a fair summary of your testimony on the role of historical evidence for this inquiry that the jury has been asked to make, that examination of the historical questions of what really occurred is essentially a waste of time because you know, as an atheist who knows that miracles do not happen, that no evidence could establish that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead.
You phrased it very, what's the word, contentiously or provocatively. I don't know anything for certain. Science doesn't give you certain knowledge. That's the difference between science and religion. As I said, science only gives you more or less probable knowledge, more or less reason to believe certain things. The reason to rule out miracles is that there's all sorts of better explanations. And in fact, I might say quickly that the term miracle is only the kind of religious word for what in philosophy of science we call anomalies. And every laboratory in the world is full of things that we don't currently know how to explain, and we look for an explanation. You could equally go on every laboratory and say, don't do any more research, God did it. Well, we don't do that because we understand that things that are currently not explainable, if we do more research, we'll find an explanation. So it's not that I know that the miracle of Jesus didn't happen, it's that everything we know about the world and everything we know about science says it wasn't possible. And so history doesn't count. It's not that I should add quickly, I don't discount history. I have enormous respect for Professor Judge and for the discipline of history as history. And in fact, I'm very interested in the history of the Gospels and the history of Christianity. It's not science. It doesn't tell you what happened, except in the sense of what happened as a matter of history, as opposed to what might have transcended everything we know about science. If the Bible said that Jesus, rode a bicycle and flew to the moon, or one of the, apostles did something like that, you wouldn't believe it for a minute.
The role of history is it not to, in this inquiry, to work out what actually happened with Jesus after he died? You'd agree with that, or do you say that it's really a waste of time to look at that as a historical question because we know it?
I didn't use the phrase waste of time. That's your phrase. I don't think it's a waste of time at all. I like reading history. I think it's extremely interesting. It's not a question of the history being a waste of time. The question is how plausible are the explanations you want to give of certain putative historical facts. I actually, for the sake of argument, I'm happy to concede all the facts. I've given you more than you deserve. I mean, I'm telling you that the history is exactly the way Mel Gibson said it was.
Mel Gibson's film, if my memory of the Passion of Christ is correct, dealt with the death of Jesus and didn't go to the next step of the question we're looking at today, but what happened after the death of Jesus. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, I didn't see all of the film, I have to tell you. I didn't watch the whole thing.
All right. Well, fortunately, there may not have been a happy ending in the film, but at least for some, there's a happy ending in the Gospels. You also said the existence of God, that all the evidence is on the other side. What do you say of prominent scientists who who are not atheists?
There are lots. I teach a class and openly as an atheist, and I give my students the best arguments on the other side, including a collection of arguments from scientists. Scientists, when they say they believe in religion, it's not with the scientific hat on. They don't get research grants for their belief in the Bible or for God. They do that on weekends, on Sundays. And the fact is that it's
And they still believe without the research.
Sure, people believe all sorts of funny things. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the claim I'm making is that when you look at their arguments, they're often very bad. That's why, by the way, I quote William Lane Craig, who knows his science and he knows his philosophy, and he makes the best arguments. Scientists are often very naive about this stuff. So they're not telling you that quantum physics tells you that God existed or Jesus was resurrected. They're not using their science. They cheat, actually.
And William Lane Craig is someone who knows science and philosophy.
Yes.
Has come to the conclusion, has he not, that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead?
He has.
And you'd accept that he's looked at some of the alternatives in terms of coming to that view?
He has.
And do you say, well, he's really got it, he's got it wrong because of his worldview that he's not an atheist?
No, that's not the reason. No, one of the reasons is he does depend on the existence of God. He says that. The other reason is that he talks about the explanations one can give for the empty tomb, for the post-mortem sightings of Jesus. He gives all of the standard reasons that your witness has also cited, and he doesn't recognise that that's not the only relevant evidence. The relevant evidence is not only, he talks about the consilience and the convergence of the most plausible story. The most plausible story is not just a historical story. That's the point I'm making. And he actually just ignores the fact, I've had a debate with him, and he manages to not talk about the relevant science and the relevant impossibility of miracles. And so I quote David Hume to him too.
And of course, if it really is not an historical story, that cannot be investigated in the same ways that evidence can be investigated, doesn't that really mean that there's nothing this jury can do to form a view as to whether or not Jesus' body was regularly raised? Wouldn't that be an outcome of your views?
The jury has a very easy decision to make, as His Honour pointed out. It's a question of the balance of probabilities. The phrase is, yes, the balance of probabilities. Well, that's an easy one, because as I'm saying, the probabilities include what's possible given what we know about the world. It's not just history. If the history tells you certain things, that's relevant evidence. I'm acknowledging, although you're suggesting that I'm discounting history, no, I'm doing more than that. I'm acknowledging all of the most doubtful history, and I haven't got time to go through why even the scholars recognise the evidentiary weakness of the history and the complexities, but I'm actually giving you the history, so I'm not discounting that. The audience simply has to decide what's more plausible on our overall knowledge of things, what could possibly have happened, and what could history possibly establish. And it cannot establish the truth or the likelihood, even the likelihood of impossible things.
So, at least for the purposes of argument, you're, I gather, accepting the empty tomb.
Sure. Well, I don't actually, but for the sake of the conversation here.
And perhaps the more critical question I'd suggest is the claimed appearances to the various disciples,
yes,
and to people who perhaps weren't disciples before the appearances. So do you say that those appearances, those people are mistaken or dishonest?
Or all of the above?
Or all of the above?
Sure. I don't have to have a view about that. I'm relying on the historical scholarship. I read the leading biblical historical scholars. They give all sorts of accounts of the conflicting evidence in the Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament. So it's a very complicated story about just what they're saying, apart from the fact that the documents themselves are of very dubious provenance. There's a lot of stuff I haven't got time to do, and I'm not a historian, but it's worth the jury understanding that if you just look at the scholarship, the historical scholarship, the evidence is very, very complex and very doubtful. We're talking about things that were so long ago. There's no, for example, none of the Gospels were written by the people they're named after, according to the scholars. They were named later on. The Gospel of John and Mark and Matthew and Luke. They were, for example, the so-called witnesses, they were illiterate peasants who spoke Aramaic, and the Bible is written originally in Greek. Well, they didn't write it. So there's all this stuff that I find extremely interesting from a historical point of view, but we're asking the jury to decide whether there was a miracle on the basis of these stories.
Well, we'll just perhaps touch base on that that topic. I think you'd said there were nothing was written by eyewitnesses. Well, you're aware that in the fourth gospel, the writer of that asserts refers to
the Gospel of John.
The Gospel of John, described as the beloved disciple. That person asserts that he was a witness
Yes.
to the resurrection.
I was quoting Ehrman, who made the remark that I said. If John said that, it doesn't mean that it's true. You don't have to take everything, as they say, as gospel. I mean, the fact is that...
Would you take anything as gospel that any of these people say?
No, because it depends on what the claim is. It depends on the claim is. The fact is, witness testimony is just testimony. His honour in court, and as you would know, testimony is open to doubt. And it's open to the most doubt when it's telling you things that couldn't happen. So, and in a way, it's not interesting to question how much of the testimony of the Bible sounds one way or the other. The fact is that the historians and the scholars, I mean, I've got interesting quotes here from somebody, if I can find them. This is let me quote you from Ehrman.
You've mentioned Ehrman a few times, and we can come to her. So,
can I quote him?
Yes.
Okay. He says, faith in the Bible as historically inerrant and inspired word of God cannot be sustained in the light of what we as historians know about the Bible. So the historians from the historical point of view don't accept that the Bible is reliable or inerrant.
Well, you're saying that Ehrman doesn't accept.
Well, yes, as an academic historian. I'm relying on him, among others.
Now, we've dealt with John as a purported witness. Letters that are purporting to come from the Apostle Peter, that's another person who's purporting to be a direct eyewitness. That's correct, isn't it?
Apparently.
And that person says what we've seen and heard. So we've got John and Peter. We also have Matthew, and I think we'd accept that there is at least controversy as to whether Matthew was the disciple known as Matthews. But you'd accept that at least there's a real argument that a third writer, Matthew, was an eyewitness.
If he claims that he was, that's what he's claiming. And it depends on what he's claiming to have seen. He didn't see the resurrection. He didn't see what happened when the tomb became empty.
Well, and it's common ground that none of these writers purport to describe the resurrection, and Professor Judge has explained that it's only in second century writings when there are attempts to fill in the gaps that we would all like to have known.
Exactly.
But that's a fact. That decision not to describe things that were not seen is a reason to believe the descriptions of what is said to have been seen, is it not?
You can't be serious. You can't take the lack of an account to give you evidence for the contrary. Them not saying something doesn't give you reasons to believe things that they didn't say.
Well,
and especially if they're trying to tell you things that were miraculous, then there's absolutely no reason to believe what they said.
Well, if a whole number of people say they knew Jesus before he died, and they saw him 3 days on the third day and following after his death, and they recognised him as that same person.
Actually, they didn't recognise him straight away. Some of the Gospels say that they didn't recognise him. They were walking with him and didn't recognise him.
That's correct. In some situations, they were delayed in their recognising him, but they did recognise him. Wouldn't you accept that that's a reason to accept the veracity of what they're saying, that these witnesses did not embellish the stories to put in all of those details that we would have loved them to have put in?
I can't believe anybody finds the story plausible. I mean, look, you can make up all sorts of stories. Let me just quote David Hume.
Well, there's going to be about 1 billion people who find it, or more than 1 billion people who find it's
Yeah,
plausible,
but more
they
than a
all
billion
idiots.
people believe all sorts of rubbish. That doesn't prove anything.
All right.
A very few people believe Einstein's theory of relativity because they don't understand it. It's not a democracy. Science is not a question of counting votes. It's a question of what there's evidence for. So it doesn't matter how many people believe something.
All right. Including prominent scientists.
Depends on what they say.
Yeah.
You take them seriously when they have evidence that is the best evidence available.
All right. Do you think you've considered this matter yourself with an open mind?
I think I'm very open-minded.
All right.
But I can explain why.
Oh, we'd
Having
love to hear that.
having strong opinions is not inconsistent with having an open mind. You have an opinion that's strong depending on how strong the evidence is. And I think I calibrate my opinions, as David Hume said, in proportion to the evidence. You're not going to be doubtful or express, agnosticism. So it's perfectly consistent with being open-minded to say, I believe what the evidence suggests. And by the way, I'll change my mind if the evidence suggests I should.
But there's no evidence that could possibly change your mind on this,
That's not
on your own
fair.
evidence, unless you were to accept the belief in God. Isn't that a fair comment?
Well, it's part of it, but the question of, no, not necessarily. Something could be contrary to our current understanding of science. Look, the reality is in my profession, as history and philosophy of science, we actually do find things that are contrary to our scientific laws, and sometimes we change our scientific laws. That's a whole lecture in the philosophy of science. In some cases, we overturn what were the established laws. Newton got overturned by Einstein. Galileo and Newton overturned Ptolemy and Copernicus. So actually, we make scientific revolutions where we come to have strong evidence that, in fact, the so-called miracles or anomalies turn out to actually be well-founded and can be explained according to evidence. So you do sometimes change your mind. So I do claim to be very open-minded after all.
Right. Now, you commented that that the Christian view was written by the victors. I think that was some of your evidence. Would you accept, though, that the Pauline writings were written around about the AD 50s, say 40s to 60s, and obviously stopped when he was executed during the reign of Nero? You'd accept that?
I think so.
And you've heard Professor Judge's evidence to the effect that the four Gospels were written in the first century.
That's right.
That's right. Now, would you also accept that in the first century, the Christians, those who believed in the bodily resurrection of Christ, were not the victors at that stage in the political situation in the Roman Empire?
Look, I defer to other historians. I'm not a historian. I don't want to pretend to be an expert on the history, but I'm reading people like Elaine Pagels, who's written a book on the Gnostic Gospels. I think she's an authoritative source. She points to the fact that, and the quote was from her about the history is written by the victors. She means that there were competing schools of thought in early Christianity, and the ones that became part of the canon of what is currently the New Testament isn't the only early historical source of Christian doctrine. And some of those Gospels were left out. To this very day, the Christian groups don't all agree about what the canonical Bible is. I understand the Catholics and the Protestants don't all agree on what the Word of God is. Well, so if you go back into early Christianity, it turns out that the canonical Gospels that were only actually very much later confirmed as orthodoxy weren't the only books. And as I say, the Gnostics were important because they didn't accept that Jesus was the Son of God, and they didn't accept that he rose from the dead. So
now, sorry. Cut in on you there, but the Gnostic Gospels were written after the first century AD, weren't they?
I didn't think so. I thought, but again, I'm happy to be corrected on the history. I'm not an expert. They were uncovered, and I thought that they were roughly contemporary with the earliest Christian writings of the Gospels.
Well, I'd suggest that those Gnostic Gospels have occurred in a subsequent era to the Gospels that are part of the canonical Scripture, and I'd also suggest that in terms of the New Testament, that the Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox branches of the Christian faith have accepted the same documents in the New Testament. Would you agree with that?
I understand that's not the case, but I'm happy to defer to better informed people on that issue. Right. I don't have a strong professional opinion about that.
Well, you'd accept also that the different branches of the Christian faith, or the Catholic, Orthodox and Protestant, would accept that Jesus was physically raised from the dead.
I understand they all think that, that's right.
And that's consistent with the references in 1 Corinthians that I referred to of the earliest Christian creed, if I can put it that way.
The earliest ones that became established as the orthodoxy, as opposed to ones they regarded as heretical. Irenaeus in 100 and whatever it was.
About 180, I think, was it? Or?
Yeah, 180 AD. He dismissed those as heretical and had a critique of them, as I understand the history. So we're talking about history, and I'm just reflecting on how the history turned out, and it might have gone a different way. If the Gnostic Gospels become modern Christianity, we wouldn't believe in the resurrection.
Well, that'd be right. I think that's probably common ground, and if we didn't believe in the resurrection, there wouldn't be a Christian faith. That'd be
no, it'd be a different Christian faith. You'd be a Gnostic Christian.
Perhaps a minute or two, Mr. Davidson?
Yes, I think I'm happy to leave it on that question.
All right. Any questions in re-examination, Mr. Hadley?
Professor Slezak, your last remark, did you say you'd be a Gnostic Christian or agnostic Christian?
I'd be an atheist Christian.
Thank you very much.
Which is also a possible position to take.
All right.
You could, if I could quickly elaborate on that.
I'm not sure that your counsel wants you to, but...
No, I'd like to clarify that. You're saying that if the Gnostic Gospels had not been discarded, but had been given prominence, then Christianity would have turned out differently today.
Of course. But my point was that you can accept a lot of the doctrines. Let me say something which I haven't had a chance to say. Galileo is a very important part of this story. Galileo had an important role to explain, as he did when he got into trouble with the church. He said the scriptures are not a scientific text. The Catholic Church fought him very bitterly over this. And it's an important point that you could be a good Christian, as he was, and as the Catholic Church finally came to accept, that the scriptures are actually about faith and morals, about how to live a good life. The Sermon on the Mount is a wonderful sermon. I can accept that as an atheist. And so you can take the scriptures as Galileo recommended, and as I say, the Catholic Church accepted, as having to do with how to live a good life, how to be a good person, all that stuff, and not regard it as a scientific text. That's what we're supposed to have learnt from the clash with the Church and Galileo. So you can be a good Christian, and as the Catholic Church now accepts science without challenge. Of course, they still believe in the miracles, but nothing's perfect.
Thank you, Professor.
Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Note
Yes,
that in the
thank you.
transcript for the appeal, Your Honour.
Yes, noted, Mr. Davidson. Professor Slezak, thank you for coming along and assisting the court and the jury with your evidence. You're excused.
Thank
I
you.
understand you have a plane to catch, so thank you for assisting and safe trip back.
Thank you.
Now, members of the jury, that completes the evidence led by the plaintiff and the intervener. We now move to the last phase of the case, which are closing arguments. They will be delivered by counsel for the plaintiff, Mr. Davidson, SC, for 10 minutes, and then there will be a responding closing argument by Mr. Hadley for 10 minutes. And then I'll give you a brief summing up. So we're almost at the finish line, and please continue to pay attention as you have so well to date. Mr. Davidson.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, shortly the learned trial judge will sum up for you. Listen to him carefully. Although His Honour has already explained to you that you are the triers of fact, you accept his instructions. He's the judge. Judges are always wiser than counsel, even when overruling objections. And that includes, and of course, judges being wiser than counsel includes Emeritus Professor Edwin Judge, the learned expert witness for the plaintiff. And we would respectfully submit that you would accept what Professor Judge has instructed and explained when you, as the judges of fact, reach your decision, that his evidence was balanced. He made appropriate concessions in explaining why these records that the applicant relies on are reliable and would compel would compel an objective considerer of the evidence to accept that Jesus rose from the dead. And with respect to Professor Slezak, with his knowledge of philosophy, would submit that his evidence demonstrated a somewhat closed mind in terms of how one would consider the evidence that has been before you, and would almost reach the stage that, by definition, you, no matter what the evidence was, by definition, miracles can't happen, God doesn't exist, and therefore, whatever the evidence is, you would have to reject this claim. Now, your verdict, though, will require you to evaluate the competing evidence in reaching a conclusion about what actually occurred. Trials, and including this one, do involve consideration of history, consideration of what happened rather than a priori beliefs that will prevent you from considering the evidence. Your view of the resurrection is basically a verdict that you will make about the honesty and reliability of the witnesses recorded in the New Testament. Are they duped, or are they deceived, or are they deliberately deceivers, or are they competent and honest truth tellers reporting what clearly was and is a most extraordinary event, an event that changed their thinking because of the event, not because of their prior wish or self-delusion. It led them to, rather than being people who would have stolen a body when they were very afraid of the authorities, it led them in a very short time to be not afraid of the authorities, be willing to face the death penalty for their proclamation of the risen Jesus. And that what caused that change, the two aspects of the empty tomb, but particularly the physical appearances to a number of eyewitnesses, and we would say that would include the Apostle John, Apostle Peter, debatable for Matthew, the James, the brother of Jesus, all of the disciples who were referred to by Paul. And it's criticised of Paul not identifying the other 500 people, but he has identified a significant number of people, more than a dozen specifically, and he has identified that of those 500 people, most of them are still alive. And that it's what they saw that changed their thinking, rather than them deluding themselves that they saw something. We'd submit that you would accept that. And that our approach, we'd submit, has been testing what occurred by assessing the reliability of those experiences, rather than judging matters as a matter of logic, saying that it cannot happen. Now, the famous American Supreme Court judge and Harvard Law School professor Oliver Wendell Holmes, on page 1 of his famous book, The Common Law, noted that life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. And members of the jury, applying your experience to the evidence of the experiences of the witnesses to Jesus returned from the dead, we'd submit that you would accept that the applicant has demonstrated on the required balance of probabilities that, as extraordinary as it may seem, Jesus rose from the dead. That is simply a better explanation than some of the counter-explanations that you have heard today. Let's just look at the two explanations that were put to Professor Judge about the empty tomb. It was said, first of all, well, it's only Matthew that makes a reference to an earthquake forcing the stone away, and that for the other references in the other three Gospels, I think it might have been said that the door could have been opened. Now, that's probably meant to be a reference to the stone being rolled away, but the Matthew account highlights the fact that something particularly unusual had happened to cause that empty tomb. And the two explanations, though, that were put, and we would submit these are more fantastic explanations than the testimony of the various witnesses, were that Joseph moved the body. Now that, we'd submit with respect, is a somewhat fantastic explanation, because Joseph on the Friday had, presumably at some personal risk, gone to Pilate and said he'd like to take the body of this just crucified person and endorse it by putting it in his tomb. And then that was done before the Sabbath, and then the suggestion that a possible explanation is that he might have then, having done that, said, "Oh, I'll move the body from there to somewhere else," presumably during the Sabbath when Jews weren't meant to do that sort of thing. Would suggest that's an unreal explanation. And the other, we would suggest, unreal explanation was the disciples might have hid the body. And again, that would be an extraordinary circumstance if the disciples would hide the body, knowing the body it was dead, and say, "Oh, look, we're going to proclaim Jesus has risen from the dead. We're all going to go out and, in some way like the life of Brian, be crucified or be killed." But we know it's not true because we've hidden the body. Now, we respectfully suggest that those suggestions are more fantastical than the suggestion we are putting to you. We also say that the earliest records from traditions, referring to the traditions passed down to Paul within a couple of years of his conversion, highlight the centrality of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And as Professor Judge has highlighted, the veracity of the accounts is attested to by the understatement in the gospel stories. So the missing details we'd all love to know, the Hollywood picture of what it looked like when Jesus came out of the tomb, who was with him, they're just not there because these people have only reported what they saw. And we've had to wait to the 2nd century when the fantastical versions come up. So the gospel writers show remarkably little exaggeration, and as Professor Judge explained, although the earlier Pauline writings had complicated theological explanations in works written before the Gospels were written, the Gospel writers did not adopt those. They just set out what the witnesses had seen. Now, there'll be an issue about whether discrepancies give more veracity or less veracity to a story. We say that those discrepancies are consistent with the evidence of honest people who've seen an extraordinary event, and some of the key details that they remember vary. We say that submission, that skepticism and disbelief is when a whole lot of people come together with identical evidence. That's when you know they've got together and worked and massaged to have a version, and that His Honour may or may not deal with that topic, but the differences are, as Professor Judge has said, reasons to accept the evidence. Now, we would encourage you, as Mr. Hadley said in his opening, to take the time. He suggested you take the time to read Acts. We would urge you to take the time to read this material. Take all the time you need for further study and reflection of this evidence, given the importance of your decision. And unlike in prior centuries, His Honour will not have you confined here until such time as you reach a verdict. Your decision is important, not just for this hearing. Even more importantly, if we are correct that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, your decision is vital for a hearing to come for all of us involving Jesus as judge, even though for those who don't believe. and for those who've accepted Jesus' claim and turned to follow him as an advocate and mediator before God. And with Jesus as an advocate and mediator is far better and at a far better price than the finest counsel or mediators you will find on this earth. So, ladies and gentlemen, we encourage you to consider carefully our claim for a declaration that Jesus rose from the dead.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Mr. Hadley, I'll give you 12 minutes by way of parity.
Thank you, Your Honour. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be wondering, why are these skeptics being so mean about something which lots of people believe was the best thing that ever happened to humanity? The answer is because the people who organised this event have asked you to put aside all preconceptions and approach the issue afresh. The hypothetical is that the pro-resurrection people have to satisfy you that their allegation is true. They have to satisfy you that their story is true. They have to satisfy you as if the consequences of you saying yes are the same as finding a person guilty in court. Now just imagine that. If you were in court deciding a case of murder, you would be very focused on that task. We have a few hundred murder cases in Australia each year. On the other hand, the allegations advanced by my learned friend tonight are unprecedented and unique in the history of the world. And yet you are asked to accept that they occurred. It's a much bigger ask than asking you to convict someone of committing murder. You therefore, ladies and gentlemen, need very persuasive evidence to get such allegations to first base, even before you consider reasonable doubts. The quality of the evidence relied on by the pro-resurrection people is disconcerting. Quick summary, Mark is all hearsay. It was written by a believer, not a disinterested investigator. By disinterested, I mean unbiased. Luke is also all hearsay, and it was also written by a believer. Neither Mark nor Luke disclose any of their sources, and the scholars are still guessing at who they spoke to. There's an implication that they had good sources, but we have to trust them. There is no indication of any access by either of them to documents that were created at the time of the events that occurred. And you'll see people compare Jesus to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had someone walking around with him every day writing down what occurred, and that material was put into libraries and was available for use by other people later on. There is no equivalent of that kind of material in the case of Jesus, and there's no suggestion that Mark or Luke had access to anything like that. So what Mark and Luke have done, they've gathered together reminiscences from unidentified people, and then the authors have written those out. Matthew is mostly hearsay. He is too fond of embellishments to be reliable on anything that could be direct evidence. He's the one that tells the story about bodies coming or souls coming out of the grave at the time of Jesus' death, something that no other person corroborates or refers to. Now, John says that he saw the tomb after others had found it empty, but he saw it in exactly the way it would look if it had been opened and emptied by humans, either grave robbers or by Joseph of Arimathea removing the body. That alternative, by the way, of Joseph doing that on the first night cannot be disregarded. You might think it's surprising, you might say, why would he do that? But it is far more likely than being asked to accept that a miracle occurred, that the body moved through the wall of a closed tomb. The idea that Joseph would not have done it because it was the Sabbath that night and he was a Jew and it would be breaking the rules, well, has no one ever in the history of the world broken the rules of the Jewish Sabbath? Or could he not have said to some non-Jews, boys, let's move the body? The point is, he had nothing to worry about if he was caught, and he certainly had time to do it. So that possibility should not be so blithely disregarded as my friend has done. Getting back to the evidence, John's descriptions of the risen Jesus involve commonplace events like fishing, or events that are no more unusual than what magicians are pulling off in Vegas every day. And I'm talking about coming through the doors. I suggest it's ambiguous as to whether the doors were shut or actually locked. And if they were locked, how could they be unlocked? But even if you got through a locked door, well, magicians do more impressive things than that all the time. Nowhere in the gospel evidence is there a decisive and unprompted identification of the new person with the old Jesus. In other words, this supposedly risen Jesus is not quickly recognised as you'd expect. There is certainly there's nothing approaching medical evidence that matches this new person with the old person. And it's passing strange that it took these people so long to come to the view, even the word recognise is a generous word, to come to the view that this new person was linked to the old body. There's, on one view, not even persuasive medical evidence that the original Jesus was definitely dead, but that's opening up a big issue. We don't need to dwell on that. Now, what about Paul? He receives and repeats these stories. He appears to add his own little embellishment about the 500, and you heard some questions about that. You can think about that for yourself. Paul does not add any facts about the matters we are considering tonight. He repeats them, and then he starts adding his own opinions and moral pronouncements, and on it goes from there. All of that does not add up to a clear and persuasive picture. Now, what about the conduct of the disciples that they supposedly changed? There are explanations for that. There could have been a reluctance to believe that the whole thing was suddenly all over, when everything had looked so good a few weeks earlier. They could obviously have been in a very emotional state, grief-stricken and shattered. And most persuasively for me, there was a conviction that Jesus could come at any time, like the thief in the night, as per the metaphor that he'd referred to. They believed he could come back any time, so therefore there was this idea, be ready, have faith, believe these stories. Moving to the reasonable doubts. You may think that some of the alternative explanations that we've referred to very, very briefly in the time we've had available are unusual and hard to believe. Some of them are. But accepting any one of them is more responsible than doing what the pro-resurrection people ask you to do. What they ask you to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to say, don't worry about the lack of direct evidence, such as you might have in a murder trial. Don't worry about the lack of direct evidence. Say yes, because we promise that a miracle happened. Now, you might be wondering, has anyone ever been convicted in a court because of an alleged miracle? I thought about this, and I think the answer is yes, it happened quite a lot. And the people convicted were called witches. Witches were accused of misusing supernatural powers with miraculous results. And the people who prosecuted those people, those accused, mostly religious authorities, the prosecution relied on the occurrence of those miracles. And they asked judges, or if they had juries, to accept that the miracles had occurred, the witches had misused their supernatural powers, therefore they should be convicted, and usually that meant execution. I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, don't fall for that one from these people when you consider your verdict. Think about it and say no. Thank you.
Mr. Hadley. Members of the jury, that concludes the evidence and the respective submissions of counsel for the plaintiff and counsel for the intervener, the cases for the affirmative proposition that Jesus rose from the dead, and the case for the negative, which is to the contrary and says that your answer to that question should be no. Tonight, and through the course of what's approaching 3 hours of deliberations, you've embarked upon a unique and unprecedented process. We have been considering the events of some 2,000 years ago, and in a context where now, in the 21st century, we are well familiar with techniques of recording evidence, and there is a massively high literacy rate in the community. And it is quite unique to postulate the position in terms of how we ascertain and verify events that happened so long ago, when there wasn't photography, there wasn't tape recordings, there was video, and most of the community was not literate. You've been engaged in as I say, a unique and difficult process. You've heard from two experts in their respective fields, an expert from the field of ancient history and a counter position from an acknowledged expert in the field of philosophy with an interest in science and history. And those highly respected and eminent professors come to diametrically opposite views in their respective disciplines. I'm following the American approach tonight, which is that I don't propose to summarise or attempt to summarise the snippet of the evidence that they have exposed you to in their evidence in chief of 10 minutes and their cross-examination of 25 minutes. But it really is a scraping of the iceberg in terms of the material when you think of the centuries of work done by theologians and historians and philosophers on this unique and of critical, continuing important topic. You've heard the evidence from professors of great learning, and the process has been one of rigorous exposure by way of questioning to the opinions which they have expressed. You will, for yourself, proceed to the process of deciding on the basis of the evidence in your deliberations whether you are satisfied. Now, you remember at the start I explained to you the balance of probabilities test, which is the standard that you will apply. This is not a criminal case, and the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt does not apply. But Mr. Davidson, SC, for the applicant, seeks to persuade you, and he has very willingly tonight taken up the onus of persuasion in terms of seeking to satisfy you. So he's accepted the onus in order to ask you to make the declaration in the affirmative that he seeks. The counter position, put very eloquently by Mr. Hadley through Professor Slezak, has sought to take issue with many of those points. Let me explain to you what a declaration is. A declaration as a remedy is a passive remedy. It doesn't make an order on anybody. It doesn't decide anybody's guilt or innocence. It doesn't command anybody to do anything, and it doesn't award damages. It's an entirely passive creature. But it is a reflection of an intellectual process that you've been engaged upon tonight. Let me congratulate you for your outstanding attention and the respectful way that you have listened and assimilated the evidence. We now move to the final phase of the case, which is for you to retire and consider the evidence and consider your verdict. And I wish you well in your deliberations. This court is adjourned.
All rise. Please be seated again. Well, of course, our thanks go to Justice Martin, who might hear us at the back of house. And our thanks go to both our learned counsels who've presented and led the cases this evening, and for our expert witnesses. Let's thank them with a round of applause. Well, as Justice Martin has said, it's over to us to deliberate. Juries don't make their decisions without first thinking it through. So June is deliberation month. If you are a ticket holder, if you've registered for tonight's event, at the end of June, you'll be invited to deliver your verdict. If you haven't registered for tonight's event, but you would like to give your verdict, then please make sure you fill in one of these response cards with an email address so you can be invited at the end of June to deliver your verdict. In the meantime, there's plenty of opportunities for you to deliberate with those you've come with, to go online to jesusontrial.org.au to see the evidence that's been presented and the papers that have been submitted. And there also are opportunities for you to join with 11 other peers to deliberate with an elected lead on what we've heard. A couple are here again in your handouts that you can take with you. Lunchtime groups where you can assess this evidence. But don't go away from tonight unchanged, as we've considered a very interesting question, but also a highly relevant one. So take June to look over and review, to ingest what we've heard from both sides of tonight's case. And then at the end of June, if you fill in your contact details and leave your contact details at the door where you came in, then you'll be invited to perhaps history's largest jury on the majority verdict will be announced at the end of June. See you next time.